Hi there, I'm just going to talk to you about Browning's Porphyria's Lover, probably the most sort of striking and memorable of his dramatic monologues. I think one of the first things to say about it is to address a common misinterpretation or problematic interpretation, which is around the title and the name Porphyria. So you will read a lot online about this meaning a disease, but the naming of that disease was actually quite some time after the writing of the poem. So the older meaning of the word, which was a name for a purple dye, is probably a more accurate interpretation or a more convincing reading. So it really tells us about the social economic status of the woman Porphyria, that she probably is a very wealthy, aristocratic young woman, if not maybe a princess, because the colour purple was associated with royalty. But if we stop just to look at the title, it's a possessive noun phrase, and it really starts out the theme of ownership and this sort of struggle for power within a relationship. So the lover, firstly, it's an agent noun, so it defines him by his love for her, but he's also owned by Porphyria, and he is not given his own name. But he is given a voice, so really we do get a potentially quite misogynistic perspective on Porphyria, who goes against some of the expectations of women at the time. You begin with a really clear exposition, so we get a very strong sense of place, and what kind of comes across to us is a very strong pathetic fallacy, and the idea that the wind and the lake represent Porphyria and the lover. It's a little bit ambiguous which represents which, so you could read it as the speaker being the calm lake who is vexed by the arrival of Porphyria, or you could read it as the wind being the violent lover and the trees of Porphyria who are torn down. But there's a very strong sense of foreboding, especially from early and soon awake, so the idea of premature death hinted to us. Then we move to the internal and we get this idea of a cottage, and cottage is a very important noun here because it connotes the low status of the speaker. A cottage would be a small home built for workers on the land of their master, the master perhaps being Porphyria's father. And you get an image of the speaker sitting alone in this dark, cold space, which makes Porphyria seem quite powerful and active as she arrives. She glides in, she lights the fire, so the verb choices are particularly important. You do get a sense of his maybe disappointment or unhappiness with her when you have this image of the soiled gloves and the damp hair, so these are references perhaps to her as not quite as pure and perfect as he would like her to be, but we are definitely a little bit surprised by her actions because she takes kind of the leading role which challenges these Victorian norms, especially when it says made her smooth white shoulder bare. So that action, that very modified noun and action seem to hint at sort of sexual activity and a confidence that would shock maybe the Victorian man. There's a lot of references to her hair which become a cataphoric reference to the murder. Yellow is quite an odd adjective to be applied and helps to make it stand out to us, although obviously we're still shocked at its use as a murder weapon. There are some lines that do evidence this idea of her being weak or ill, so murmuring, too weak for her heart's endeavour, but they're probably more conforming to the idea of quite a nervous, hysterical Victorian woman than they are to someone dying and needing euthanasia. The real struggles that this relationship probably faces are her commitments to marrying an upper class man rather than him. So there's reference to vena ties with the very violent verb dissever. And then tonight's gay feast, suggesting there is some event that she should be at rather than with him in his cottage. Again, one so pale, I think modern readers tend to associate that with this idea of her being ill, but pale was a real sign of beauty in Victorian women because it suggested staying indoors, not doing any work, and being very white British. There is a sort of climax to him as he realises, at last I knew Porphyria worshipped me, and he's surprised by that, and then a sudden shift from that to debating what to do. So there's a real sense of possession and ownership. She was mine, fair. The repetition and then the plosive alliteration foregrounding that moment to us. Really, the actual murder is presented as almost a resolution rather than a climax, or perhaps an anticlimax. The language being very casual. I found a thing to do. And the enjambment, just making it sort of flow very naturally, casually, up to the horrible revelation. I wound 3 times her little throat around and strangled her. Like in other Browning poems, we have the caesura used to highlight that moment of shock, so we, as a listener, pause to digest it. The real sort of madness or delusion of the speaker is in his reaction to it. No pain felt she. It's impossible that she felt no pain, given the nature of the murder. And you see his traces of doubt in the sort of repetition and rephrasing of that statement. There's lots of description of her body that's actually more positive and more loving than while she's alive. He talks about her using natural images without a stain, whereas earlier she had soiled gloves and damp hair. And then the sort of mildly necrophilic description of him kissing her, and again, real sense of delusion, blushed. She is dead now, she cannot blush. So the burning kiss, that kind of very romantic image, is made very sinister and disturbing to us. The description of the body really stresses that this time my shoulder bore her head. So it's that idea that he's the more powerful and in control one now that she's dead. Makes him very similar to the Duke of Ferrara. Again, more hints at euthanasia when it says utmost will, but it's unclear whether Porphyria knew anything about the plan or whether she wanted to be killed. Her darling one wish, as he calls it. The final few lines are very disturbing. The image of them sitting together now, that temporal reference, making us strongly imagine the scene of him sitting cradling her corpse. And then we have this sense of no consequences. All night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. So Browning perhaps hinting at the another interpretation that the speaker has killed her because he can, and because he feels that there is no God to challenge him or punish him, which you could see as contradicting the sort of angry, pathetic fallacy earlier on, with storms often being interpreted as God's wrath. The setting also makes the ending work more successfully because it is less likely that they will be caught or that anyone will come looking, because nobody would expect to find her in this cottage.